I've got another really positive story. And one of the things about today, from my perspective, is that I've seen more positive action today on Florida scrub jays of what's going on in the state than I have for a long time. I'm actually I think it's really cool. It's made me get off my butt more in terms of way of thinking about what's going on around the state and how we can do more. But today I'm going to talk to you about an area known as the M4 population. That's meta population, number 4, that actually comes from Brian Stiff's work, is how those numbers were managed. And this was a population that was being impacted or has been impacted by mining activity of Mosaic, which is where I currently work, and I'm the lead ecologist at Mosaic. A little bit more about me is I started at Archibald Biological Station as a PhD student. Actually, first came here in 2000. Been around too long. So I would be amiss not to actually mention a couple of people. Lauren Diener, who's in the audience, put your hand up. Lauren Diener has been involved in this project since almost its inception, and worked with Reid Bowman for a long time, and obviously Reid himself, who has a far-reaching influence on forest scrub jays across the state. And some of you may not know all of the impacts he had. And to not working. Which one do I press? Is it this one? Just a bit of recognition to Reid, but specifically for this project, because Reid actually was engaged in habitat conservation planning for the mining as a consultant for Mosaic, at the time was IMC mining. And without his input, this mitigation project would have been nowhere near what it is today. And that's an absolute. So this is a dedication to him, and it's one of the lasting legacy impacts he has had for scrub jays. So where are we? So Mosaic mining is in what they call the Bone Valley phosphate reserves. If you don't know, Florida has one of the largest phosphate reserves in the United States. It is a reserve of about 100 years, which is pretty long. And it is supporting probably 65 to 70% of the agricultural community in the whole of the US. So there's a lot of industry following this particular part. So it's very powerful industry, if you want to put it that way. So it's on the west coast there. This way. Yeah, right in here. And the other thing I wanted to show with this map, it's obviously a light enhanced map, is all the areas we've been talking about. You could recognize these scrub jay populations all in here, just off the urban areas. Ocala, which stands out like a big salt farm. Yeah. And then here's another big area. And this is the M4 population. You know this, and I think, Lauren, you took this picture? Yeah. I love this picture. This is a territorial jay. It's like just the expression. I've never, birds with expression. This is phenomenal. So they're despotic. They claim everything they can. This is important when you talk about a vacant year-round for life. They want it. They're associated with Florida scrub and fires, which we're not going to stay long on this. You've seen this graph at least 4 times I've counted so far today. So if you don't leave here as a manager knowing that you need to burn, there's a serious problem. So you do have to burn. They're very associated with burning, and their success as a population is extremely tied to habitat management and habitat structure. They're monogamous. Has there ever been one that wasn't found? You might know this. A non-monogamous jay. Was there any extra pair? Was there? How many have been found now? 2?
That's less than 2%.
Less than 2%. Okay.
I want a nice bottle of wine.
Okay. And then we have a series of other things that we've lots of people have been discussing. But the populations, and we're talking about what you just showed, about 8,000 individuals or 8,000 groups remaining. 8,000 individuals, sorry, I get that right. They're spread across the state, many of them in very, very small populations. And that's an important take-home message. Very few of them in any larger populations. And most of them, there's only one that is above 1,000, and that's Aphelocoma. Yeah. Now, the area I'm talking about is right here, designated the M4. And realistically, it was a bunch of very, very small populations isolated by non-habitat and a very, let's just say, dysfunctional metapopulation is the best way, a non-equilibrium. And Lauren has put together some of these figures over time. So the mining site, this has all been mined in here, was impacting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and actually later there's 7. Lots of land that actually had scrub existing in them. There's no scrub in them now that's actually being occupied by scrub jays at all. And then this larger green area here is a network of scrub that was outside of that mining area. Ignore the blue dots for now, because that's our current expanse of individuals. But all of these sites which had birds, they were translocated from these sites to here. And this is known colloquially as the mosaic wellfield, but it's actually really supposed to be the manatee wellfield. And so it's actually manically stable. And the idea was bringing all these populations into a central location. You've now changed a metapopulation dynamic from being lots and lots of dispersed individuals into one location, and hopefully bringing all of their genetics with them. And it should grow more. And then if it became a source, that population starts to expand and provide individuals to the rest of this. And you can see the blue dots here. There was no birds in those areas, except, Lauren's going to tell me, don't tell lies, because there was 1 or 2 around, but the main population up here was actually moving ranch. And the rest of these areas were almost devoid. And if you went out there, there would have been 30-foot sand pine this big across these landscapes, not scrub jay habitat. So what Reed did, and Forst actually, really argued for this. Let's do this quantitatively. How can we have the best response in a habitat conservation plan under different scenarios? Now, the final one was translocate birds from donor populations and move them to a core population. But they tested a whole series of other strategies, which were don't do anything, probability of extinction very high, do some on-site work where you protect the scrub on site and you avoid it, but they're still dispersed, not connected, still high extinction rate. On-site with some increased management, less extinction rate. But if you actually take everything to a core area under quantitatively population modeling, based on what they knew then, that was the best case of probability of extinction dropping 23%. So let's go with the best one, quantifiable data. And it was accepted. US Fish and Wildlife Service signed off on this incidental take permit of 14 family groups of jays that would be moved in a particular way. And sorry about the writing. So there's 7 donor sites, all within 10 miles. An incidental take permit habitat conservation plan was developed for these 14 family groups. Now, translocation initially was not done in one big swoop. They were taking actually helpers of those breeding pairs. So we're trying to leave a breeding stock there to actually get as many birds out of this as possible. Whole groups were eventually translocated into the season of mining was about to occur, where they actually removed the whole habitat. In total, 51 flora scrub jays translocated from 5 of these sites, because 2 of them, or at least one that I know of, but I actually think 2 of them never ended up having jays, or they died out before they could be translocated. So very small populations. All those 51 jays were moved between the year 2004 and 2010. By the way, that's the largest translocation effort ever undertaken on the species. As part of the habitat conservation plan, which a lot of people don't know, is they were agreed to staggering mining across those sites, so there would only be one at a time that's actually impacted. So there would be time, or as much time as possible, to get as many birds out of the translocation effort as possible. excuse me, then it was very rare to allow translocation of an endangered species as part of a habitat conservation plan at the time. So this was novel. And there were some rules written into this incidental take permit about what would happen, what would be the adaptive plan, what happened if it failed. And so there were some things that were asked by, how can you please investigate how well this translocation is actually occurring? And these are some of the things: timing of release. So there was a category, this is after knowledge, but whether it was early in before the breeding season, that means December, January, or late, just before the breeding season. I don't like those terms, I didn't make them. So whether they're male or female, whether they were very young birds, so within their first year, or they're older birds, and then also whether they were released solitary or as a group with a relative or as a family. All things you can think of that would affect how a bird sticks translocation. And so that was part of that. Typical methods: great bird, charismatic bird. They love peanuts, and that's the number one reason you can do this easily. So they were all trained, they were caught, they were transported, all of which was relatively new and only been done with mummy studying before that. Lots of measuring, weighing, all these sorts of things. And something that is probably not a positive aspect, but we didn't know at the time, is using release cages. The thought being that you take an animal to a new environment, you hold it in that environment for some time, allow it to get used to its environment, and then release it. But putting wild animals in cages in itself is stressful. So this sort of activity is no longer done. Most translocations now are very fast. Dave, what do you call it? Grab and dump or something? It's not a great term, but it's actually true, and it's much more successful than putting them through a lot of stress. So as fast as possible, get them to the new site. One important thing here is that because Reed was on this project, there was a forethought to actually collect DNA sample. And Tyler, he's up the back there, is going to talk about some of the genetics associated with this translocation of population. So this went on, and one of the other things which we're not going to talk about today is they actually, part of the requirements of the incidental take permit was to actually track every translocated individual and see what he did in fine scale movements. That data, by the way, has never been analysed very well, and so it should be. We will do it. So understanding this translocation, I mentioned these before, and Reed, just before he died, was working on this with us, and we started to analyze this a little bit heavier. And I think there's some take-home messages here that everybody in this room who's engaged in translocation should actually look at, because they could help. And we should follow these as the best data. And so here, I'm going to put my glasses back on again, because I can't see at the same time. Here is like the timing. Remember, early is in December, and there's 51 birds. There was 26 birds in December and 25 just before the breeding season. This is a pretty consistent result, saying that early release was a lot more successful, actually 40% more successful than the late release. And some of the ideas around that is you don't want to be putting scrub jays into a system where their reproductive hormones are already ramped up. And so they've already got high levels of androgens running in their system, and they're really aggressive. So they can sneak in December if you want to. Now, the other thing that was came out highly significant was males were more likely to be successful than females. So this suggests that if this is the case across all translocations, you actually have to take more females. Okay, because remember, they're monogamous, so you need just as many females as males to actually increase your population. And so that's an important take-home message too, to me. And remembering that this was to a site where there was actually one pair of jays nearby. There was no jays there, so it's a blank slate. Things that had no effect. Whether you release them solitary or with a relative, no effect, but notice the sample size, I wouldn't take this as given. But here, age So you can release young birds, and this was a big question. You can release young birds and they'll be quite successful. And that's been shown probably in subsequent translocations that have occurred since this one, that young birds, first-year birds are really good, just as good as adults. So either would be fine from my perspective. Can you see those red lines? So in here, they were basically placed in the manatee well-filled scrub habitat here. And all these individuals, this was all prepared for scrub jays, okay? Outside of it is an area known as Jewett Preserve, which is a much, much larger area, a lot more scrub. And then south of it, a place called Edward Chance Reserve, water management district. And the Jewett Preserve was actually in the process of doing good habitat management as well. It was devoid of scrub jays. And they were doing that, and it was part of the habitat conservation plan to engage with nearby landowners to actually come to management plans that would actually support scrub jays. The point, though, that I'm trying to make here is nearly all of them moved well less than a mile. They stayed within the actual release zone. There's relatively few that went long distances. So when you do a translocation, they're going to stick pretty close to where they are, or at least the ones that actually survived. Remember, there's only 29. So that's sort of short-term success we're talking about of actual translocation. So long-term, they're getting banded, but then we actually want to know what the F1s are, what the F2s are doing, and actually the population on the whole. What did actually happen to those birds, those 14 groups, those 51 jays? And so you have to do all of this intensive monitoring, which takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. Everybody in here knows that. And here's just some written out results. 29 of those 51 actually bred. That's a 57% success rate. That's actually pretty high for a translocation. Of that, most of them came from the early ones, which is really important. These 29 individuals had 122 breeding years, all right? The average number of attempts per translocated bird was 4, and the longest was 14 years. So there are birds that are surviving very similar to what you would see here in Archbold Biological Station. So they're sort of fixed traits of scrub jays. They produced 193 fledglings, and out of those 29 birds translocated, 51 breeders. They didn't replace themselves for it. 2 times 29 is not 51. And this is a point, I'm not going to talk about this, high reproductive skew, because Tyler's going to tell us all about that, aren't you? Yeah, he is now. All right, and so here's a graph like you've seen in many places, is hopefully a growth graph, and this was one. So from July here, 2004 to 2010, right where this red diamond is, this is when translocation stopped, all right? And the birds have been moved over here, and from 2004 to 2007, there was not a lot of success, and actually a lot of those birds didn't enter the population. They switched to early after that, and then there's actually a lot more survival of the translocated birds, and there was more breeding attempts. Now, the correlation to that, though, too, is that there was more habitat being brought online at the same time, which needs to be acknowledged. So they had more places to go. As a side note, because they're despotic, some of these territories were taking up 150 acres. So these birds were flying 150 acres and saying, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. And then you drop a solitary translocated individual in there and they just get absolutely beaten and they leave. And so just think about that as we're going through this. So the population has gone through some perturbations. One of the things I notice in here all the time is the lag effect of when you have large group size. Right here are 2 good instances, and then a increase in population after that. So you reach a certain group size, and then there's enough birds to actually create new breeding territories or buds, however they do it. So there's going to be multiple ways they do it, but it has to be new. So it's de novo or buds. So that's a graphic of like the population, but how did they do it spatially? And this is a graphic of that spatial population. And thinking back to some of the stuff that Fitz was presenting, what's the budding sort of concept in here, or where they're actually increasing next to each other? Go. Hang on. The moving? Oh,
Yeah.
Right. So the year is up here, 2008, and starting to grow. So this is where they all landed. Now watch a couple of these scrub patches as they come on. Yes. And then this is in 2021. So I didn't have time to actually add all the other years into this. But I think there's a really, really good spatial concept of what jays do there. So they create a de novo and it's actually growing, filling that patch and then moving on to the next patches. And that says something to me about their movement across the landscape and how we should be potentially helping them recover or knowing how they're going to recover through a landscape. So now you can actually see it's actually filled out quite extensively, and that there's high density patches and low density. So this is the only thing I'm going to say here is that all these birds were brought in from these donor sites to this location. So it's a genetic pool that we thought they were interacting, genetic pool, but over time, from those initial birds that were actually translocated there to the current sampling of those birds, this population, like many populations that are being shown, has actually gone through some in-breeding depression as well. That's all we're going to say there. But what do we have to do now? So how do we actually recover that population? What is the best way to do it? And I'm really excited for some of the genetic talks that I've seen so far today and actually being able to plan what you should do rather than just guess. And another aspect of this whole project is that how many breeding pair are needed. And Dave said 75 to 100, which came from the vortex modeling that Bob Lacey has done in the landscape. And that's really, really true. And we sort of guessed that a fair while ago. But here is some of Bob's work related to actual gene diversity. And so if you have 75 to 100 territories, you need here. That's the green and the purple line here. You need that level of individuals, highly diverse, to actually maintain your genetic diversity 95% or above. If you have less than that number of individuals in there, your genetic diversity is going to actually always decline under what Bob's work is actually stating. That means all populations that are less than 75 groups currently are constantly probably going through inbreeding depression and not bringing in sources. Just think through that, how many are underneath that in Florida. That's the bad part of this. But the good thing is populations are still growing and we're not sure how well they can grow and what they can do. But what we need to do is like try and help them the best way possible. Take-home messages. Translocation definitely helped demographic success in here. It went from 14 groups that were in the instant take-home. The maximum we've hit is 44 groups, and that were related to those initial 29 birds. Long-term monitoring to answer these questions is essential. Demographic success should always be checked against genetic consequences because you could be setting yourself up for a potential failure in the future, and we need to understand that. One of the points here, Stiff actually originally modeled the M4 population as not being a viable population, and that would not be true now. It would actually be modeled as a viable population. And friends and managers and partners and talking like today are probably one of the best things we can actually do to save this species. That's it.